Most people, until recently, well, we didn't even really think about pandemics and epidemics. But pandemics and epidemics by from pathogens of various types, bacteria, viruses, and so on, have had huge effects on human populations and huge effects on animal populations and plant populations. So one of the biggest ones, pandemics, was called the Black Death. This is a painting by a guy named, a Flemish painter, Belgium, named Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death. And the first appearance of the Black Death, not the bubonic plague, but the Black Death, that's the one where the biggest one, was in the 14th century. And then there are periodic outbreaks of the Black Death plague throughout up to about the 1750s or something like that, and then it finally faded away. But there have been other outbreaks as well. And this, look in this very dark, sort of terrible sort of painting. So he painted it, I think, in the 1500s after an outbreak. So an epidemic is a fast-spreading, harmful, unexpected pathogenic disease that infects a lot of people. So the mid-14th century, 1348, bubonic plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population, actually even more than that. We don't know. But it went through, and you can see when it hit different places. The earliest was mainly in June in North Africa and Italy, and then even earlier than that, Sicily, Sardinia, and it had a huge effect on the human population. In fact, there had been a famine, so the population was already smaller than it had been in the early 1300s. But the population after this bubonic plague, the Black Death, in 1340s, 48, it took about 200 years for the European population to actually recover. And this epidemic, it also affected other places, East Asia, all the way across Asia, and Northern Africa, and maybe more. It's hard to know. The best documented was in Europe. And it actually had a huge effect on European culture. So the Middle Ages, this was still the late Middle Ages, and there was very little new knowledge being found out, and there was a feudal society where serfs, workers, lived on land and they were owned by aristocracy, and they would grow up their whole life. They'd work for a master, basically. They'd have to give their master all kinds of food that they grew, and then they could live there on that food as well. So when the plague hit, there were already some cities, but not very many. So it wiped out so many people that suddenly there weren't enough workers to harvest the crops. And they didn't need as many crops as they had. And a lot of the aristocracy was wiped out too. And so after this, the Italian Renaissance started. And probably it started this big change in the culture, European culture, because the Black Death had changed the population structure and who were masters, and suddenly workers, because there were so few of them, they could actually make money now. There was a limited resource. And so instead of being owned by the masters, they could sell their services. Okay. It actually turns out we know what caused the plague. It's a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And we've recovered this DNA from this bacteria from people from 3 different plague events that happened. The first one was the Justinian plague between the 6th and 8th century at the end of the Roman Empire. And they recovered the DNA from Yersinia pestis. So that was, you can see this in orange here, that it seems to have originated in China or East Asia, and then finally spread across Asia and into Europe. And then the Black Death in green was the big one, but the Justinian plague had a huge effect too. But the Black Death, that one from the 1300s all the way into the 18th century was the last, I think, evidence of it. That really changed Europe. It really changed. It was really marked the end of the late Middle Ages and in the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy, and then which then spread across Europe. And then finally, there was a third pandemic in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it spread throughout. Actually, it probably started in the middle of Asia. Just so you know, bubonic plague, there's 3 different forms actually. There's bubonic plague, which is spread by the fleas of rodents. There's pneumonic plague, where it actually gets into the lungs and is contagious. And then it looks like actually that the Black Death and maybe Justinian plague is carried by head lice that then bite people. They thought it was a bubonic plague through rats and fleas, but it doesn't look like that anymore, because at the beginning of the Black Death, there was no reports like there had been at other times of big die-outs of rodents. And I've seen this actually. There's up in Tahoe, Lake Tahoe, there is an epidemic of bubonic plague among the rodents. Mostly, very few people get infected. The rodents do, though. And I used to work up there in a valley that was very near Lake Tahoe. And I worked up there for, I don't know, 10 years or something like that. And one year, one summer, there was this huge rodent population we were trapping. There were deer mice, there were wood rats, there were pocket mice, there were chipmunks of a number of different kinds, ground squirrels, regular squirrels, gray squirrels. And all of a sudden, we were finding all these dead and dying rodents by the side, along the road, and everywhere throughout the forest. It was amazing. I mean, you couldn't miss it. And we actually recovered with gloves on one of these rodents. We sent it up to Tahoe to the public health officials, and they confirmed that it was in fact bubonic plague. So it's still around, but fortunately, bubonic plague is easily, or plague in general, is easily curable if you get it in time, because it's a bacteria, and erythromycin and other antibiotics work very well against it. Okay, so we're going to talk about infectious agents, in other words, pathogens. Disease-causing organisms. They cause disease. Now, most microorganisms, including bacteria, a lot of viruses, uh, microscopic fungi, and perhaps some single-cell eukaryotes, are not pathogenic. That means they don't cause disease. In fact, our whole gut microbiota, it's called the microbiome, is actually central, and it's full of very, very many different species and many individuals. In fact, there's more bacteria in our gut than there are human cells. And they don't generally cause disease because they're kept in check by the immune system, and a lot of them give us benefits by helping digestion and making vitamins. So, a pathogen is a disease-causing organism. Most microorganisms don't actually cause disease. Either we never get infected, or if they're part of us, our immune system keeps them underneath at bay. So, an infectious pathogen is a pathogen that is able to enter a host and cause a disease. Okay, that means it's infectious. It gets into a host, into us, causes disease. Contagious means a pathogen that is spread easily between person to person from close or direct contact. For example, airborne diseases like influenza and COVID-19 and even Ebola are fairly easily spread. The first two through the air, Ebola not so much, more direct contact. And then there are other modes of transmission, in other words, how a disease is spread. And where a disease comes from. A lot of, as we'll look at, sometimes a disease jumps from one host, one kind of animal, into another, or into a human host, and that's called a zoonotic disease, but we'll get through. So there's different kinds of ways that a microbe can be transmitted. If it's airborne, that means if you breathe out, you breathe, let's say, viral particles, let's say influenza, or you sneeze. Some very, very, very microscopic droplets carry the virus, and people can breathe them in and then get infected. That's the same thing as COVID-19. And so airborne transmission is generally causes a contagious disease, a highly contagious disease. There are other contagious diseases or where the transmission is direct contact with bodily fluids, with sweat, with like Ebola, handling the dead. People get infected with people who died from Ebola. Okay. Then there's a bunch of other diseases that are water and foodborne diseases. Cholera is a good example of a waterborne disease and a foodborne disease. And they live in the water. If you drink infected water, it causes infection in the digestion. And then you have huge amounts of vomiting and diarrhea, and usually if you die because of dehydration. And then there's foodborne diseases, cholera also. And let's see, what else is there? Oh, some E. coli, norovirus, salmonella. Those are foodborne diseases. So you have to have ingestion or of infected food or water. And then vector-borne diseases transmitted by an intermediate animal between hosts. So the most well-known one is malaria, where a person has a disease, they're bitten by a mosquito, the mosquito gets the blood, picks up the disease organism, a single-celled protozoan eukaryote, starts to multiply in the mosquito, then the mosquito bites another person who's not infected and infects them. So there's a lot of different vector-borne diseases that are carried by insects and other animals from one human to another, and also from, let's say, between other animal species as well. There's avian malaria, all kinds of different things. Went infectious up here, pathogen that is able to enter our home. So I said we're going to go over these different modes of transmission. Not all infectious agents are contagious. That means easily transferred through the air or in close contact. So anthrax is a pathogen that infects a lot of ungulate animals that we grow, like sheep and cattle and things like that. And anthrax, the microbe, it's a bacteria. It produces spores that then can often stay in the soil. And then, let's say there hasn't been any sheep there for a while. When new sheep come in, they get infected and they start getting the disease. It's a very bad disease. There's two different kinds that humans get. Contact that you get on your skin, and then inhalation, which is actually often fatal disease. So it's an infectious disease, but it's not easily infectious for humans. It is not contagious, and nothing carries it from some other animal to a human. So that's infectious, as we. So, okay. Contagious pathogens spread from person to person. Usually they spread like influenza or a cold or COVID-19 through inhalation of the virus in the air on very, very small particles when the person who's infected sneezes. Or contact with contaminated items where the virus, let's say, lands on something and then you handle it and you manage to ingest it that way or get infected that way. So those are contagious pathogens. There's a lot of them. Let's see, smallpox and measles are both very contagious. In fact, measles is one of the most contagious pathogens out there. It turns out it has about a 90% transmission rate. If someone with active measles case goes into a room and with people, about 90% of the people are going to be infected if they're susceptible. Okay. And then there's also close contact, like sexually transmitted diseases. Gonorrhea, syphilis, both bacteria, a virus that causes cervical cancer, and then, of course, HIV. Okay, So, not all contagious pathogens are spread by means, right? So, of person to person, inhalation of spores, we already went over that. T. gondii is a parasite. Water and foodborne transmission, ingestion, and STDs, and then transmission through an intermediate host like Lyme disease or mascaria, malaria, or tick fever. So ticks are a big. They transmit Lyme disease between various rodents, deer, and people by biting them, just like mosquitoes do. Okay, so these are the three that we're kind of going over again. On the left is a spirochetes that cause syphilis. Okay, so what makes some microbes pathogenic and more deadly than the other? Well, virulence is defined as a severity or harmfulness of a disease, and it's a heritable trait. In other words, some diseases have alleles that make them particularly deadly to humans. Now, you would think, oftentimes it used to be thought that why would a microbe do that? If it's really deadly, you kill the host, and how does it get transmitted? But I'll show you now. So, and then there's oftentimes certain kinds of transmission cycles are less virulent than the others. Okay, and for the pathogen, this can be a heritable trait. You can actually have variation. Some strains might be more virulent than others. Some strains might be more easily transmitted than others. So these different modes of transmission. There's airborne diseases like colds, influenza, measles. Now, measles is very easily transmitted, but it's not particularly serious. Smallpox was a serious disease. It kills about 30% of the people who are infected with it. Of course, it's been wiped out now. Vaccination, so there's no more smallpox, but it was a terrible disease and had huge effects on people. It not only killed them, but people who survived were often blind, and they had other problems with connective tissue. It was really bad. But so that's one of those diseases that was actually spread through the air from person to person, but not as much as with like influenza or COVID-19. So the thing is, most airborne diseases are less virulent because they require a host to actually be able to move around and breathe out and sneeze and stuff and infect other people. And if you're really, really, really sick, you can't do that. You're lying there basically incapacitated. So there are contact diseases like Ebola, but that's very, very close contact with someone who's got lots of virus on their skin and on their vomit and on their feces and all that. Then there's vector-borne diseases like malaria or tick fever or Lyme disease. And these can be fairly virulent because if you think about it, let's say you get malaria. Well, you're not going to transmit it to someone through the air, right? You need a mosquito to bite you and then bite the other person. Well, if you're completely, you've got chills and fevers and vomiting and you're basically in no condition to walk around, you're lying there, it's very easy for a mosquito to bite you and then go infect someone else. So the disease can be very, very harmful and still be transmitted. And then food and waterborne pathogens are also often rather virulent. Not all of them. Norovirus is not particularly, but certainly typhoid fever, cholera are good examples. And then finally, there's zoonotic diseases, where there's a disease that starts in some other animal and sometimes jumps to human populations. So a lot of viruses are very specific. They only infect certain populations of animals and certain species of animals. Whereas others can be transmitted between different hosts, like rabies is a good example. Can be transmitted through all kinds of different mammals. It turns out most influenza originally came from bird populations, and new influenza viruses often get started in bird populations, like in waterfowl and things, and then get into human birds, like waterfowl and chicken, and then game birds and chickens and things like that, and then get transferred into humans. But they don't necessarily are transmitted that well between humans. So there are some zoonotic diseases. COVID-19, the current pandemic, it's amazing that we're having a pandemic, it looks like it traveled. The original strain might have been carried by bats. Bats are generally not more likely to carry a disease than others. Rabies is carried by all kinds of different mammals. Hantavirus is carried by rodents. Ebola virus looks like it might be carried by fruit bats, and then infects other primates. There's all kinds of diseases that Lyme disease infects rodents and deer and can be transmitted to humans. Okay, but transmitted between humans, it requires a vector, namely a tick. Okay, so if a disease is really, really virulent, you're going to be lying there, not moving around, and it's likely that very little chance you're going to actually transmit it, except for maybe someone who's helping you with direct contact. And so you're not going to really transmit it. It's going to be more likely it'll be less harmful. You'll feel bad, but you can walk around and actually, let's say, give people a cold, right? Okay. This is ticks carry a lot of different diseases. These are all different kinds of water and foodborne pathogens: typhoid fever, cholera, food poisoning, salmonella, hepatitis A, and there's many others. Well, if you look at how virulent something is, so this is the frequency of pathogens that are deadly. So deaths per infection along the x-axis. Okay, so if you influenza is about 0.1%. It's not very virulent. It doesn't kill very many people. Most of the pathogens that do that are directly transmitted and easily transmitted and are contagious. But if we look at, let's say, vector-borne diseases that are carried by, let's say, mosquitoes or ticks or something like that between different people, we see that a lot of them are much more deadly than others. So how things are transmitted affects on how dangerous they often are. Okay, so there's different types of pathogens. There's eukaryotic pathogens like Giardia, Plasmodium, trypanosomes. There's bacteria. Here we have E. coli, Staphylococcus. Here's a human, or let's say a large eukaryotic cell. So Plasmodium might have a eukaryotic cell. Remember, eukaryotes have a nucleus and organelles and things like that. And then the smallest things are viral particles, and they're very, very small. In fact, they were actually, people inferred that they were there, but they couldn't see them with a light. You can't see them with a light microscope. You need an electron microscope, whereas you can see eukaryotic cells and bacteria. So here's some different eukaryotic pathogens. We've got some eukaryotic worms that are multicellular, like river blindness, elephantiasis, leishmaniasis. You have single-celled eukaryotic pathogens like amoeba that cause dysentery, Giardia, yeast cells, trichinosis for multicellular, and then protease, dysentery, sleeping sickness, and then malaria. And then fungi cause athlete's foot and thrush in your mouth. So these are eukaryotic pathogens, not bacteria or viruses. And they come in all different sizes and shapes. They come in cocci, round bacteria. They come in corkscrew. These are spirochetes. They come in rod-shaped bacteria. Some of them have flagella, so they can move around. Most of them are actually not pathogenic for humans. A lot of them live in our gut and on our skin and don't cause us any problems. In fact, benefit us. So, most bacteria are good. Bacteria in our intestines produce vitamins, including D, K, and B12. Many foods are produced by bacterial action. Many human foods, like cheese and yogurt, are bacteria to actually change them. In fact, or we use things like yeast that do that. In fact, before we could humans actually evolved to be able to drink milk, they could still use milk products by turning it into cheese, let's say, or yogurt, where the lactose, which is the milk protein, is broken down into glucose and galactose, which our body can use. We even use bacteria for cleaning up oil spills. The threat to human health: disease-producing bacteria are pathogenic. Symptoms: a lot of the symptoms problems they cause with us are caused by the toxins they actually release, like tetanus, which Clostridium causes tetanus and paralysis, lockjaw. Botulinum causes botulism, a disease mostly of waterfowl, but also of humans. Bacteria have an extra layer on the outside of cells called it's a cell wall. Most antibiotics, remember, antibiotics work against bacteria, no other pathogen. When they do it, the antibiotics degrade the proteins of the cell wall of the bacteria. That's how most of them work. Not all of them, though. Some antibiotics actually get into the bacterial cell as well and kill them. Okay, and so salmonella, anthrax, gonorrhea, botulism, impetigo, leprosy, Lyme disease, tuberculosis, strep throat, tetanus, diphtheria, bacterial meningitis, pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, all kinds of stuff. So antibiotic resistance, we all already talked about this, how bacteria populations through mutations can develop resistance to different antibiotics. So random mutation, some variants are resistant to antibiotics, and exposure to antibiotics provides a selective advantage to the resistant variants. They survive, the other ones don't, and suddenly you've got antibiotic resistant bacteria. Also, we have viruses that, viruses that cause disease in all kinds of different things, not just us, including plants. A lot of plants are also infected with fungi and bacteria too. And there's rabies virus, infects many different mammal hosts. Influenza virus often starts out in birds and then has jumped to humans. And then something called a bacteriophage, and these actually are viruses that infect bacteria and kill them. So viruses work. They are not cells. They don't have cells of their own. They don't have metabolism. Usually what they have is they have a virus like this, and around are these proteins that are designed to help them get into cells, and inside there's either DNA or RNA, and the DNA or RNA is injected into the virus, and it's kind of like terrorists, and they take over the machinery in the nucleus or in the cytoplasm for making proteins and stuff, and they start making the proteins they need for their outside and more copies of themselves. So they kind of hijack host cells to produce viral components. And then they leave the cells. And usually when they leave the cells, it's called lysis. In many cases, they kill the cells. So that's why a lot of them are very deadly. But some viruses are actually in us and hang out and don't necessarily cause disease. Like chickenpox is a herpes kind of virus. And after we get chickenpox, it doesn't cause very bad disease. The virus travels up our neurons and hangs out in our neurons for years and years, and it hangs out in our DNA, incorporates into our DNA, and sits there and doesn't cause disease. So cold viruses attack membranes of the respiratory system. Measles infects respiratory cells as well as immune cells in lung tissue that then express a respiratory immune system, including dendrites and macrophages. Rabies viruses and polioviruses. Well, rabies viruses attack neurons and then cause behavior to help them transmit it. Polioviruses initially infect intestinal cells, but some of them actually then are neuronic cells that cause the real problem with polio. HIV viruses actually also attack immune cells like T helper cells or helper T cells, and in fact that's most people died from HIV, not from the virus itself, but because the immune system could not keep all these other bacteria, viruses, and stuff that actually cause disease. So a lot of people with HIV, it would take many, many years for their immune system to degrade where it couldn't keep things down, and then all of a sudden organisms that normally don't cause disease in humans started showing up, like this kind of a bacterial pneumonia called Carinii, or toxoplasmosis, which is a eukaryotic parasite that usually we don't ever, our immune system clears it, or it kind of walls it off. Well, so HIV kind of destroys our immune system, and only new drugs have saved us. Many viruses are cell specific, some are species specific, some others are not. Viruses I mentioned can be latent, in other words, dormant in our cells, in our DNA for long periods of time inside host cells. And then they can, let's say, reemerge from HIV, AIDS, chemotherapy for cancer that suppresses our immune system. These viruses can start being expressed again. They get out, or from steroids, or our immune system becomes less strong as we age, and oftentimes diseases, let's say funguses on our skin, start showing up as people get older. Stress can do the same thing by suppressing our immune system. So HIV infects cells of the human immune system called helper T cells. They ultimately destroy the immune system, and then patients die of all these infections that their immune system would normally suppress. Fortunately, some antiviral drugs, there's more and more of them, were developed. The first was something called AZT, which stopped the virus from making copies of itself inside a cell. And then there's now a number of different antivirals like that, and then protease inhibitors that break up or into the proteins into smaller subunits for the viral coding. So with a triple combination therapy, whereas you used to only have one, there would be resistance. Resistance to AZT in viruses happened rather quickly, so it would work for a little while, and then they'd be resistant, and then it would come roaring back. With a triple cocktail that uses different times of the viral cycle and different parts of the viral cycle, they've been very successful in making HIV latent. And once you stop, it comes back, but otherwise, your immune system starts to build up again. Ebola, it's one of the deadliest diseases. Anywhere from about 30 to 90% of the people who get it die. Humans are not the main host. It looks like it circulates in bats. It kills primates as well, other primates like gorillas and chimpanzees. It looks like HIV, by the way, is a zoonotic disease that was carried by chimpanzees and other monkeys, and that transferred over into humans. And the virus in monkeys and in chimpanzees, it's called SIV. It doesn't cause them any real disease. It inhabits their cells, but it doesn't cause real disease. Whereas HIV, it does in humans. Ebola is caused by these viruses that look like these long stringy things, and causes hemorrhagic fever, excessive bleeding, and it usually kills people very quickly. Fortunately, they've now found a vaccine for it, developed a vaccine for it recently, and they've also developed some therapies where they use antibodies that they grow and then inject into people that kills the virus. And so even if you get the virus, if they start getting antibody treatment early, they can oftentimes survive. And then COVID-19, and it's amazing. I never thought that we would actually see a pandemic. Well, we've seen pandemics before. HIV was a pandemic that first showed up probably in the early 60s. It looks like there was a English fellow, but it's probably been circulating in humans for a while in Africa originally. It jumped from chimpanzees into humans because of the bushmeat trade. They'd eat chimpanzees. That ended up becoming a pandemic, especially after in Africa the emergence of large cities and lots of sexual transmission with prostitution, and then it got into the rest of the world. That was a pandemic. It still is a pandemic. Fortunately, we've got treatments for it. The influenza pandemic of 1918, the same sort of thing. Well, here we are. We have another pandemic with this virus. It's a coronavirus. Like a lot of cold viruses or coronaviruses, it's actually quite a bit more infectious than influenza, and it has a higher mortality rate, anywhere from 1.3 to 3.2%, or even higher in older people or people with immune system problems or who have died by diabetes. And so you can see inside it has an RNA virus, and then it's got these proteins, spike proteins, on the outside that it uses to get into a human cell, usually a human cell in the throat or in the upper respiratory the respiratory system, and then finally in a lot of people clear it and then they don't get very sick. Others, it gets into the lower respiratory system and causes deadly pneumonia. It also appears to can infect other kinds of cells, including some blood cells and also brain cells. It started in China. You can see where most of the cases are. Actually, most of the cases are now in North America and Europe, even though it started in China. But we actually think that perhaps China has been underreporting the cases, but we don't really know. A lot of Africa seems like it's not infected, or a low infection rate like India. But it turns out that those are probably, they haven't been tested, they have much higher infections rate, and it's just not showing up as being high infection rate, but a lot of people are getting sick and dying in those places as well. So, shelter in place. You don't want this disease, and you don't want to give it to anybody else, like your parents who are older, who are more susceptible and are likely to suffer worse consequences.